Senator Fulbright, a man I never met, changed the course of my life. He created a scholarship program in the 1940s as a way of bridging together parts of the world that were divided after yet another war. He had the big idea, the kind of genius that happens when you think beyond the way things are now and you consider how things should be. I traveled on a Fulbright fellowship to the tiny but extraordinary West African nation of Senegal in 2016 in order to study the Great Green Wall of the Sahara and Sahel. This is an ambitious project designed to build a wall of trees, an 8,000-kilometer wall across the desert in order to combat climate change. As a geographer, I was drawn to this kind of physical diversity in Senegal, but it was the people that kept me coming back for more. Dust storms would periodically sweep across the north, signaling a dramatic start to the rainy season. And down south in Casamance, massive thunderstorms would strand our team at compounds for an entire afternoon, leading to extended conversations over plates of yassa jen. This is a fish and rice dish that's eaten family style, and whatever protein was on that plate was always shared with me first, a generosity that was hard to digest. In a place where fish is increasingly scarce, they gave it to the person who needed it least. The peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians in Senegal is the stuff of legends. And my time spent at mosques and churches brought this collaborative history to life. Fishermen sat on beaches with me and explained the power of jinn, a kind of magic, and talked with me about the everyday strategies used to keep their boats safe while at sea. Later, we swam laps with them far out into the Atlantic, which was both terrifying and thrilling. And soon, these friends invited us to celebrate the holy Muslim day of Tabaski, where a sheep is slaughtered as part of a feast to commemorate the strength of Ibrahim's faith. We planted mangrove seeds in wetlands with ecologist Aidar El Ali, seed by seed, propagule by propagule. Theirs is a world made by hand. But I didn't learn about the Jola shipwreck until the day before I finished my fellowship. I'd been a geography professor for years, having taught courses on Africa, but I'd never heard or read a word about the greatest disaster to strike Senegal and the Gambia, and I was ashamed. My friends in Senegal told me that the Great Green Wall was a good project, but that it was the wrong one, and they encouraged me to learn about the Jola so I could share it with American audiences. I was hesitant. After all, it wasn't my story to tell. But then my colleagues hit me with a Wolof proverb, which is one of the traditional languages. And it goes like this: Sabu du foot bopam, which means soap does not do laundry alone. Or in our parlance, it takes a village. So I came home and pitched the idea to National Geographic, and we were declined. I reworked the proposal, submitted it again, and we were declined. And I have to admit I was disappointed. These were our people, these geographers. And plus, there were so many stories in Nat Geo about the legendary RMS Titanic. But I didn't give up. And we eventually got funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities to return to Casamance to work with Professor Eli Diada, head of the Jola Survivors Network. And looking back, I believe that so much of our good fortune had to do with building relationships. Doors just swung open. So here's the story. Built in Germany for the Republic of Senegal, the MV Jola was operated by the armed forces beginning in 1990. It was established to help fix a transportation problem rooted in cartography. That is, to find a quick way around the Gambia for citizens traveling back and forth for work or school. The MV Jola also allowed residents to avoid the long road through the Gambia, where President Jammeh had been accused of human rights violations for several years and what would become decades. If you look at a map, which you should, Senegal resembles a kind of giant monster mouth looking westward toward the Pacific, almost seeming to drink the salty ocean, with the Gambia smack dab in the middle of it. Our friends in the Gambia would politely disagree with this metaphor, but you get the point. The British and French colonizers, they carved up the continent, dividing families and communities, and they left a modern-day transportation nightmare in their wake. So, the MV Jola represented a kind of geography of hope for many citizens. She was a beautiful ship, a 2,087-ton roll-on, roll-off ferry, with the shipwreck nerds call a ro-ro, with a carrying capacity of 44 crew members, 536 passengers, and 35 cars. She had to be capable of traversing both rivers and oceans, so she was a bit of a multitasker. The victims' families and survivors I spoke with had fond memories of traveling aboard the ship, especially at night, listening to music, sharing food, falling in love. It provided a sense of adventure not unlike the experiences of those who boarded the Titanic in Southampton in pursuit of better lives. In fact, many Senegalese knew well the story of the Jola, having recently seen James Cameron's epic film, subtitled in French. On the night of September 26, 2002, the Jola left the colorful port of Ziguinchor in the south. She traveled down the Casamance River and then turned north when she hit the Atlantic in preparation for a 17-hour journey. She had nearly 2,000 passengers aboard. Students, mango sellers, fishers, a few dozen international tourists, many French, none from the USA, but more than 3 times the allowable limit. When the ship passed the small island of Caribbean, she could be seen listing to port, so much so that some chose not to board the ship at all after catching a glimpse of the crowds. Though, just like other forms of transportation in Senegal, it wasn't unusual for the Jola to be overloaded. Teranga, a Senegalese word taken to mean hospitality, is the spirit of generosity that pervades everyday life. And that social norm allowed people to travel for free when needed, including the 450 kids who were aboard. At around 11 p.m., the Jola sailed into a storm, which was also not unusual for that time of year. After all, hurricanes that eventually land in our corner of the world begin their lives in the eastern Atlantic as baby atmospheric disturbances. Senegal and the Gambia see a lot of that original action, and so the September storm was not the Jola's first oceanic rodeo. But one of the Jola's engines had not been properly serviced before going back into operation. And within 5 minutes, given the high winds and waves, the boat listed further and then capsized, trapping and eventually killing 1,863 people within the 4 decks of the ship. It happened so quickly that one of my friends in Ziguinchor would later describe it as the length of a song. These losses included Michel Diatta, brother of Ali, a football coach, and 26 of his middle school players who perished. The Senegalese footballer Aliou Cissé lost 12 members of his family in the shipwreck, a scale so profound that many locals still refer to that day as Senegal's 9/11. There were 64 survivors, one of them female, small compared to the 600 women aboard who were mostly inside, asleep with or taking care of their children. Space is still gendered in parts of the world, and women carry large burdens. Mariama Diouf was 4 months pregnant. It was her first trip on a ship, and she lived, thanks to herself and to local fishing boats who served as first responders at the scene. Mariama would later name her daughter Jola, 2 female survivors. Another survivor was Usman Keita, a first-year geography student who knew the Jola well, having worked on the carved wooden boats that loaded merchandise onto the ferry. He said that the journey was always a good time to talk about October's exams and to catch up with high school friends. He's now 47, and he remembers trying to escape through a corridor leading outside, but the slope was too steep. He said that when he finally got outside and hit the water, it tasted like oil. When the Jola capsized, no alarm had gone off, no distress call had been sent to Dakar or Ziguinchor. Only around 7 a.m. did the authorities learn about the disaster from passing boats, many of them foreign vessels that should not have been in internal waters in the first place. The Senegalese aircraft and Air Force did not send search and rescue efforts until almost noon, and by then, it was too late. But all of that said, this is and it isn't a disaster narrative. There are already enough stories about Africa perpetuating the myth of a troubled continent. This is instead a testament of hope and resistance in the face of an avoidable, predominantly Black, Muslim tragedy that killed more people than the Titanic, yet receives just a fraction of the media attention. In 2022, I connected with the New York Times and convinced a West African-based reporter to tell the story of the Jola on its 20th anniversary. He did, which helped put the Jola on the map. But the article still fell short of highlighting the extraordinary humanity of people in Casamance. The Jola is a sad story, but it's also steeped in hope and sheer grit. For 20 years, the people of Casamance, people like Elie Diata, had been fighting their government to raise the ship, which sits in just 60 feet of water off the coast of the Gambia. People want to honor the victims. It's a mass grave site. It's diveable. We were actually there the summer before last, honoring those who died in the wreck. Yet the Jola has still not been raised despite offers by the international community to help. Yet, families continue to fight for restorative justice. And this year, the Jola Memorial, the structure of which is shaped like a boat with portholes, will officially open to the public as a space for contemplation in the fight against forgetting. It's no exaggeration to say that this experience built enduring relationships between us and our friends in Casamance. We wrote a book, we created story maps, and we started a Colorado-based podcast called Geographies of Hope in order to elevate stories of people who were getting it right, despite dominant, dystopian, apocalyptic narratives. And the work continues. There is a word for this in Wolof, a Sufi phrase called Rafet Njort. It means beautiful optimism in the face of tragedy and great difficulty. I know what you're thinking. Rafet Njort is different from toxic positivity. Rafet Njort is the belief that good things are coming, that tomorrow is and will always be a better day. I imagine that Senator Fulbright would have been down with this concept too. So you may be wondering how this experience changed me. In the beginning, I admit I was filled with a kind of searing irritability. It was difficult for me to live like the Sufis and to be beautifully optimistic, in part because a surprising number of people wanted to challenge the facts upon our return. Our son, who was 8 at the time, and witnessed to many interviews in Senegal, he sat in their living rooms, he watched their televisions, he drank their tea, He would later find himself debating the Jola with classmates or teachers. "Are you sure?" people would ask him. "Was it really a ship or wasn't it just a ferry?" As if it mattered. Bigger than the Titanic? Really? I think even at that age, our kid knew that something about this was unjust. Children understand equity. But eventually it was my mom who made me realize that it was not my job to manage other people's emotions. All I could really do was to carry this story across the Atlantic like a tropical disturbance that eventually becomes a storm or even a hurricane, one so loud and raucous that people put down their Titanic books and simply listen and realize that important lives are being lost all across this globe. And not just here. So that became my only goal, the simple privilege of telling a story in a way that put West Africans at the center, rather than at the margins. Senator Fulbright, he shrunk the world for me, and so many others with one simple but elegant idea: to build bridges. He wanted us to look forward while periodically glancing in that rearview mirror so as not to forget the past. Speaking of bridges, a new one, the Senegambia, now connects two countries once divided by a fat ribbon of a river. And President Jammeh, he's long gone, facing the international courts for crimes against humanity. And Senegal, they built a new, better, safer ship called the Aline Sito Diatta, named after a Jola heroine and a symbol of resistance who died fighting the French. The Aline is a moving, maritime memorial. She carries it all, the large burden of loss and memory and water and hope. And may her bold, steel presence help the victims of the Jola finally rest in peace.